Okay, let us start. Uh, okay, good morning, students, once again. I have given you the link for your attendance in the chat box. You can click on there and then give your attendances. Okay, so far 10 people are there. So on the screen, I'm sharing the part of the lecture on vulnerability. We were discussing yesterday also that vulnerability is a very interesting subject, and in our terminology, we are going to adopt it in the form uh, that we can define it as the degree of loss or damage. So, vulnerability depends on many factors, and then we can categorize it into different subheadings as well. So, in broader context, there are four subtypes of vulnerability. One is the physical vulnerability, one is social vulnerability, another one is economic vulnerability, and the last one is environmental vulnerability. But you may come across many different other types of vulnerability as well, because this, as I said before, it is an evolving subject. Many people have their own definitions and uh, interpretations of the term, and this applies not only to vulnerability but all the terminologies and the definitions that we have been discussing up till now. So, vulnerability or physical vulnerability may be determined by the aspects such as population density levels, remoteness of a settlement, the site, the design and material used for critical infrastructure and for housing as per UNISDR. Okay. So, yesterday we took the example of the two different houses which were actually built with different kinds of materials, and that actually contributed to their different levels of vulnerability in the context of a flood hazard. Also, we saw that if the exposure or the level of exposure is different, then also the level of vulnerability is different. That was the second example when we saw that if the flood level that actually affected two types of houses but with the same kind of material or construction material, but one house is more exposed or it is more inundated, that house may be actually experiencing a greater vulnerability compared to the one which one is less exposed or under less inundation. Okay, so physical vulnerability, if we want to describe it, population density levels also may be one of the contributing factors to the vulnerability. So if there is a flood that comes in a population where we have people with densely populated areas, then obviously in a collective way, those populations will be more vulnerable to the one who are less densely populated. Then also the remoteness of a settlement. If someone is more remote from the critical infrastructure facilities, like during the time of a disaster, if your accessibility to a hospital or if your accessibility to good roads are not there, probably you will be more vulnerable. It also goes to the site where you were staying, the topography, those kind of things also determine, and these are actually coming into the broader context of physical vulnerability. Design, we discussed it yesterday. If it was a single story house or if it were a multiple story house, that will also determine the vulnerability. Materials used, whether it is a concrete or RCC house or if it is a bamboo thatched house, maybe that will also determine the level of vulnerability. In the example, it says that wooden homes are less likely to collapse in an earthquake, but are more vulnerable to fire. So, if the hazard is different, then also the level of vulnerability may differ. So, it will depend on the material of construction, it will depend on the exposure to the same hazard, and Thirdly, if the type of hazard is different, then the same house or same materials or same type of construction also can contribute to different levels of vulnerability. So this example is for wooden house, it is less likely to collapse in an earthquake, but it is more vulnerable to fire. Okay, so can you, in your own judgment, think of a different physical vulnerability? Probably just think whenever the class is over, and then let us come open for discussion maybe some other time. Okay, next on the vulnerability list, we have the social vulnerability. So social vulnerability actually incorporates the inability of people, organizations, and societies to withstand adverse impacts to hazards. So this one I am highlighting in the red color. This is important. So it is due to the characteristics which are inherent in social interactions, okay? Institutions and systems of cultural values. So sometimes some cultural norms and values also contribute to the level of vulnerability. By the way, can you hear me? I'm actually using a different. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, good. I'm using a different setup computer today, so that's why I'm asking you again. Okay, so how does cultural norms or values can contribute to vulnerability? Uh, can you just give us an example, or do you have something in your mind that can just open up? How can societal norms contribute to vulnerability in your terms? Yes, Bhargavi Sunwal, are you there? Simi Kolita, Rima
Yes.
Sunwal. Yeah. So,
Yes.
how do you think? Okay, I'm just obstructing the screen. Okay, so look at the screen there. So it says that we are actually discussing vulnerability. So on the vulnerability section, we are in social vulnerability. What, how is social vulnerability constructed, or how is it determined? So in the definition, it is highlighted that due to the characteristics inherent in social interactions, institutions and systems, or cultural values. So what, according to you, probably a cultural value or system or a belief system that can contribute to the vulnerability during the time of a hazard? Can you just think of it? Cultural values. It is not only that it increases vulnerability, don't think it in that terms. The same cultural values can reduce the vulnerability. Can you think? Okay, just let me elaborate here. So during the time of floods, or whenever we experience flood, if you go to some flood prone areas, you don't have to go too far. Take an example of the Assam Valley. Okay? Normally, what happens in our many of the cultures, we construct houses which are typical of the pole houses or sanghors that we call it, right? So these are actually, we have this culture of building these houses. So do you think this type of houses actually increases or decreases your vulnerability during the time of floods? How? Does it increase or decrease? Yes, speak up. First of all, have you understood my question? We have far way to go. Actually, we are just in the first module. But unless your these conceptions are clear, uh, probably you will not really find the interest in the topic. That's why I'm asking this thing repeatedly. How do you think cultural values can contribute to a vulnerable or vulnerability during the time of a disaster? So I have just given you the example. Like, let us think of floods. And then you think of a cultural system that we adopt when we construct our houses. Normally, many of many people in Assam, we go for our pole houses or tanghors, whatever we call. Whenever we have some floodplain areas, you will obviously see it. So, do you think the sanghars actually increases or decreases the vulnerability? How will you describe it? Speak up. Hilpi Bora, are you here? Oh, Andhya Fakya, are you here? Roktima Sunuwal, Ritumoni Deuri, where are you actually? Yeah, Roktima Sunuwal, are you there? Can you hear me? Okay, Simi Kolita,
Yes,
can you
sir.
yeah, can you just try to answer this question of mine? Do you think sanghars or pole houses increases or decreases the vulnerability during the time of floods?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sir,
Yes.
in my view, I think the Changar will be less affected in flood as
That's
compared to other
yes.
house.
Yeah, that's true. So that's what I asked. That's what I was asking. So if you live in a house that is a sanghar or pole house, the pole house is less likely to be affected by floods. Why? Because the water doesn't have the ability to exert pressure on the walls because you don't have walls on the first floor. It will just come, it will remain for some days, and then it will go, right? But on the other hand,
Yes.
if you construct an Assam type house or an RCC house in the middle of the floodplain, then obviously that house has a greater chance of getting collapsed during the time of a flood. So you decrease your vulnerability by living in a sanghar or by living in a pole house, isn't it? But again, if you further go and introspect yourself, the idea of constructing a changar is there in the belief system already or there in the culture itself. So this cultural beliefs or cultural systems or how to construct a house if you are living in a flood prone area actually sometimes are very effective in the reduction of vulnerability. Okay, so this we don't have to really train ourselves to build a changhar or pole house. So in many of our societies the culture itself teaches us, isn't it? Then again, sometimes these cultural norms also increases the vulnerability. Let me give you an example. So yesterday we were discussing the Great Indian Ocean Tsunami. It was in 2004, right? 26th of December. So if you were following the news, you would have noticed that during this tsunami in Andhra Pradesh or in Orissa or in Tamil Nadu, those areas which were actually affected by the tsunami, a lot of people died. I'm talking about Indian context. And if you look at the numbers from a point of uh, uh, differentiating between the casualties in terms of male and female, then there were a lot of female numbers which actually showed up. So this actually was also inherent due to a cultural norm. Why I'm speaking is that uh, during the time of tsunami, water comes in a very high speed, and then the only way that you can survive is you have to run away from the water. So normally, what happens in the southern India, most of the women they have a culture of wearing haris. Hello? Yeah. So they have a culture and belief of wearing saris. So imagine yourself, you were wearing a sari and then you were trying to run away from the floods. So because the culture was there that you have to wear hari if you are a woman, this actually contributed to their increased level of vulnerability when the flood water just came or the water from the ocean just rushed inside. So they couldn't run. That was one of the very important reasons why many women actually lost their lives during the time of the Great Indian Tsunami. Another cultural belief or system. So we are putting emphasis on the culture. So in the recent study in Nepal, it was noticed that many women were experiencing uh, similar respiratory disease. Uh, so when it was later on investigated, it came into notice that because normally what happens in those households in the villages in Nepal, the trend is that or the cultural system is such that women has to take care of the houses inside and then normally the male folk they go outside for work and in the lack of proper uh, fuel they use this kind of goober gas or goober mostly to for the purpose of cooking. And if you spend too much of time in such an environment, uh, you expose yourself to a greater level of hazard uh, of this air pollution. So you are exposed more to carbon monoxide, you are exposed more to carbon dioxide or nitrogen levels. So that was one of the reasons why many of these women were showing up, even at a younger age, a lot of respiratory diseases. But that if you look deep inside why this was happening, this was because of their increased level of vulnerability, and then it was contributed by their cultural norms and belief system. So this was just an example. This has been almost same even many other societies, not only in Nepalese society. So just you have to think. You have to just think. You just look around and then see what actually is contributing a higher level of vulnerability by a lot of cultural norms. Okay? There may be plenty of examples like that. And then it may happen during a non-disaster time or during the time when the disaster strikes or a hazard strikes. Uh, so the definition goes due to the characteristics inherent in social interactions, institutions, and systems of cultural values. It is linked to the level of well-being of individuals, community, and society. So vulnerability can have an individual aspect as well as it can be a collective vulnerability. So in the collective vulnerability, maybe many people who are actually quite adaptive to living with floods, possibly in areas where flood is almost frequent. So they develop a collective capacity to tackle these hazards. For example, floods in Bangladesh or floods in many parts of Assam are quite natural events. So the communities which normally dwell in these type of areas, they know how to live with these floods. But suppose you imagine there is a flood that comes in Yemen or a flood that comes in Saudi Arabia. So people or flood sometimes comes in Rajasthan also. So in these areas, people they don't have this knowledge of coping with these newer hazards. So for them, their collective level of vulnerability actually is very less compared to someone uh, who has this experience of living with the floods um, for ages or for generations. Okay, so you may have your individual level of vulnerability as it can have uh, or vulnerability can also be in the level of communities and societies. Okay, It includes aspects related to the levels of literacy and education. So your level of literacy and education also can contribute to your level of vulnerability. Okay, so literacy and education actually will come under social vulnerability categories. Okay, so can you think of another example where literacy actually can contribute, or less literate? If you are less literate, or if you are even more literate, how does your level of literacy can contribute to your vulnerability? Huh? Can you think an example? Yes, who is there? Ritumoni Deori, are you here? Asif, Asif Ahmed. See, these are not something we are learning very new things. These all we notice every day. Just you have to reorient yourself from a different perspective, looking at those things. How can a level of literacy or your level of literacy can affect your vulnerability? Literacy as well as awareness as well as education, whatever you want to say. How does it affect? Yes, Bhargavi. Oh, you see, I want my class to be interactive. This is nothing right or wrong. Now I have real doubts. Are you there or not? Asif Ahmed, are you there? Hello, Asif Ahmed. Yeah, Simi. I think you are the only one who is actually speaking. Okay. Can you give us an example where a level of literacy can affect the level of vulnerability?
Mm, level of literacy. Now, nowadays, various programs are organized to make people aware of how to deal with earthquakes and all. So,
Yeah.
if people are not literate,
Yeah.
so,
Hmm. So literacy and
so
awareness, I think, are somehow a little bit different. Literacy, I really don't know what may be the sociological context of the word literacy, but if you can read and write, probably you can be termed as a literate, isn't it? So you can think of a situation where if you cannot read whatever is being written, and then by that you are actually uh, endangering yourself. Okay, so just think of an example that you have a transformer. Okay, a big transformer where you just step up the voltage, right? So it is quite often we see it across many of these urban or even in rural scenarios. And then it is written 400 volt with a danger sign. You are not supposed to go inside a perimeter of the transformer. So if someone is not really literate, he, without knowing what may be the consequence, even without being able to read whatever is being shown up there, just enters this perimeter, he puts himself in danger. So this is a very probably a good example of without being literate, you can throw yourself at a greater level of danger, or you can just expose yourself into a level of vulnerability. At the same time, education, yes, of course, education also is very important. And then you were saying is awareness. So during the time of an earthquake, normally people have a tendency to fly away, oh sorry, from run away from inside the houses, and then you go into areas where you have open spaces. But imagine a situation, suppose someone is living in an apartment 9 stories above, 10 stories above. He or she doesn't have this. luxury of running away. So, what, according to him, should be the right path to choose during the time when the earthquake strikes? So, this is how he has to make himself aware. So, if someone makes himself aware of this, then he has a less vulnerability during the time of disaster. Otherwise, if he tries to run away from 10 stories up to the ground level during the time when the building is shaking, that is actually he is putting himself in a more vulnerable situation. So when do you have to run? When do you have not to run? When you don't have to run? These will come across as your tools of survival uh, only if you have a level of awareness. Okay, so awareness, level of awareness, your level of education, your level of literacy, everything can contribute to how much vulnerable you put yourself during the time of a disaster. Um, we don't have to go very far. Just take an example of wearing this mask in these days. So people are all the time, even when the moment you want to call someone, says that you have to wear a mask during the time of pandemic. You have to wear a mask. Whatever, these are the discussions. But if you just look across your surroundings, how many people are actually really wearing these masks? Yeah. So if he or she is not really doing it, probably you are putting yourself at the same time other people at a greater level of risk. Or by doing so, you are making yourself more vulnerable against this disease. So whether you should be wearing the mask or not, it will come from your level of, I will not say literacy or education, but your level of awareness. So even an illiterate person, or even someone who is not educated, he may or he or she may have this level of awareness that during the time of this pandemic, I should not forget to wear the mask. At least this should be one of my priorities whenever I should be going and then talking to someone else. Or if you are going to a common area, but that will ultimately be decided by the level of awareness. Okay, then after that, the existence of peace and security. How does peace and security contribute to vulnerability? If you are at peace, or that means if the country is at peace, okay, inside and outside with the neighbors, or if the country is at war, so that also can contribute to the levels of vulnerability. But my question is how? Yes, Agorkolita, are you there? Yes, Agorkolita. How do you interpret this context? That means if you say that if the country or if you are at peace with yourself or if the country is peaceful, then it says that it can contribute to whether it would have more or less vulnerability. It doesn't say it will have less or more vulnerability. But your level of peace can determine your level of vulnerability. But how? Peace and security both. Yeah, I actually I don't know. Maybe these things you should ask yourselves. Okay, even not if not now, but later whenever you are kind of not really preoccupied within the class, just think how level of peace contributes to a level of vulnerability. Think of a country you are in Syria, or if you are in Iraq or Afghanistan, where all the time people are fighting with each other, or there is a civil war that is going on in the country. So think of those people who are living there, individuals just like you and me. Are they really more vulnerable to natural disaster? Are they less vulnerable to uh, disaster situation? If there is an earthquake that comes right now in Yemen, or if there is an earthquake that comes right now in Syria or Lebanon, or even there is an earthquake of same magnitude that comes in Japan, which people will be more vulnerable in terms of the level of overall peace in the country or security? Okay, access to human rights, same thing.
Yes,
How the
sir.
judiciary is functioning in your country? Do you have belief in the judiciary system? Do you really consider human rights as some individual or elementary rights in the system? System of good governance. Okay, so how about good governance? If you have a belief in the hospital, so if you fell sick, the moment you go to a private hospital or a public hospital or a government hospital, okay, so in terms of giving a good example, suppose you fell sick during the night, then your immediate neighbor or maybe an immediate who is taking care of your immediate guardian, your brother, mother, sister, father, whoever is there, he or she wants to take you to a hospital nearby. Do you have this belief that by going to the hospital you will be cured? This is your belief in the governance. If you have a good governance, definitely the hospital should be able to function the way it should function. Okay? How much belief do you have in this governance? That will depend, or that will ultimately govern or guide your level of vulnerability. Social equity, positive traditional values. How much of traditional values are we actually keeping with ourselves? So traditional values, as the other one, an example that we said, we in the flood prone areas, we should be constructing pole houses. Are you really sticking onto it? Yeah. Customs and ideological beliefs also. Overall collective organizational system. So many of these things actually will contribute to our level of vulnerability. And this vulnerability, we are talking in the context of whenever there is a hazard that may strike. If there is a flood, how good the hospital is. If there is a flood, do you really have a point where you can just go and take your relief? Okay, how good the communication system is, how good the supply is. So all these things uh, will ultimately contribute to the level of vulnerability. And all these examples will come under our social vulnerability. Okay, so this is definition. I'm not going to really ask you the definition in the class, but in the exams, though this is somehow a class where satellite technologies and geoinformation is the primary focus, I may ask you the small questions. Okay, like how do you think that uh, good governance has an influence on vulnerability? So you just think and then you write. Okay. So it has an example that is given. When flooding occurs, some citizens such as children, elderly, and differentially able may be unable to protect. Okay, so one of the other important factors that will come under social vulnerability is the age group. The age group, the elderly or the young or even the women folk, or sometimes maybe if you have someone who is differently abled, if you have it in the house, so probably you will be more vulnerable as in terms of a family, because you don't have this option that you can just leave everyone and then run away. You will have to take care of these people. Okay, so as a family probably you will be a little bit more vulnerable than one family who doesn't have these elderly people, or who doesn't have really children, okay, who may be unable to protect themselves or evacuate if necessary. So think of all these things in terms of vulnerability. Then one of the very important factors that actually govern vulnerability is our economic conditions. Okay. So if you have money to spend, okay, you can secure your surroundings. If we don't have money to spend, we lie exposed to the threats posed by these hazards. For example, if I have money, I can build a house at a higher level. I can be safe if during the time of a flood, or if I have money enough, I can build a house which can withstand a magnitude 8 earthquake. But if I don't have money, I will not be able to do these kind of things. So during the time of the hazard strikes, I will be more exposed, or I'll be in a way more vulnerable. That is, if you investigate the root causes, sometimes always these economic conditions. Uh, Money is a very powerful factor here. So at the same time, again, it may be in the individual level, it may be in the communities, or even in nations. So if you think in terms of the one of the very biggest disasters or worst disasters, I'd say, was the 2011 tsunami that came in Japan. In terms of economic damages, it was in billions and billions of dollars. But the country is able to spring back quickly, or other ways, the country is more resilient because these are wealthy nations. They have, as a country, money to spend. On the other hand, you take an example of Haiti, the earthquake that came in Haiti. I think it was in 2007, maybe. Just you have to check, eh? So the country actually flattened the infrastructure in such a bad shape that even till today it is struggling to just become economically independent. The whole country, even now, as of this date, it is relying heavily on relief and rehabilitation and food and shelter, mostly being donated by these international NGOs and then donations from other wealthy countries. So if a country is really strong in terms of economics, in terms of monies to spend, that will also depend, or that will actually contribute to their level of vulnerability. Same thing goes as for societies, as for families, and for individuals. So you can think of plenty of examples like that, where money is one of the very important factors. So in the example, it says poorer families may live in squatter settlements because they cannot afford to live in safer or more expensive areas. So you don't have to go really far here. Just look at the places in and around Guwahati. So during the time when it is raining, you will often come to hear the news that many of these families or many of these homes which are being constructed in the hills are actually being flattened by by a lot of soil or debris as landslides that uh, being poured upon these houses. So what may be the root cause if you really want to investigate? People have to come to this urban environment in order to generate their livelihoods. But living here is really expensive thing. Living means living in a proper, safe place where you can just safely uh, protect yourself from these hazards such as landslides. So in that case, someone has to really go up to the hills in order to stay. So even if you stay in the hills, you don't have this awareness that you shouldn't disturb the normal slope of the hills. So you do what we do, we cut the slope of the hills. And then in the process, we disturb the natural uh, stability of these slopes. And when the rain, or during the time of rainfall, the pore water pressure increases, and then these houses, these families, these neighborhoods, everything that comes under a vulnerable condition. And then often we hear the news that people are actually being uh, uh, buried under the rubble, and that it becomes a very sad news every year. On an average, maybe you will just see this news happening during the monsoon time. But if you really look into the root cause, why people are mostly poor, We have to live in this urbanized situation for our livelihoods, for our better future. But what can we do if we cannot really afford to stay in a proper neighborhood? We have to go up to the hills. Okay, so this meeting is saying it will end in 5 minutes. Then I'll just share you another link and then we can come online. Okay, so this is now 10:15. How about we meet after maybe 15 minutes or maybe 10:30, 10:34 around that time. Okay? Yeah, let's meet at 10:30 or 10:35 around that time.